Varying your diet of Chinese reading and listening practice is often considered good, indeed necessary, but this could be wrong. In some cases, variation makes things too difficult, and then narrow reading and listening is a better option. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about a certain approach to reading and listening that will allow you to bridge the gap to real Chinese. In other words, it will allow you to approach more difficult topics without spending 90% of your time with your nose in a dictionary. Before we get to that though, I'd like to mention that we're coming up on the 3rd-year anniversary of this podcast, and that means that I will run another Q&A session. So if you have any questions about how to learn Mandarin, please send them to me at editor@hackingchinese.com or ping me on social media. If you want an answer immediately to your question, you should check out my article 101 Questions and Answers about How to Learn Chinese, where I answer the most common ones that I get all the time and which covers most of the basic things when it comes to how to learn Mandarin at any level. And as usual, there will be a link in the show notes. Okay, so let's continue with the discussion of narrow reading and listening and how that can help you learn Chinese. As I said in the intro, diversity is usually viewed as a good thing when you're reading and listening. You don't want to read the same things over and over or two similar things, because then you don't get the full range of the language and you limit yourself in that way. But depending on how we define diversity here, I think that this is actually wrong, or at least it is wrong in some cases, where narrowing your focus is actually a good thing and it makes Chinese much more approachable. So to begin with, I will talk about this from a beginner perspective and talk about beginner reading and listening, and then I will move up the proficiency levels and I will also cover then intermediate and advanced cases, and this whole discussion is relevant regardless of what level your Chinese currently is. Naturally, it will differ a little bit how you apply it, but the principle still holds. So what is the biggest challenge when we start reading and listening to Chinese as beginners? I think most listeners to this podcast are native speakers of Indo-European languages such as English, Spanish, French, and so on. And for us, the problem is that there is almost zero overlap in terms of vocabulary between our native language and the Chinese. Naturally, if you speak Japanese, there is a pretty big overlap in the written language, but definitely not the spoken, or at least not in a very transparent way. This lack of overlap means that there is a very high threshold before you can actually read something that hasn't been written specifically for you. And if you're a zero beginner, this probably means a textbook, because even if you pick up a very simple story, it will contain so many new words that you will spend 99% of the time looking things up and trying to make sense of them, and 1% actually reading. This is hard to avoid, especially if you're studying on your own, and if you do have a teacher who can help you, well, then you still rely on someone tailoring what they are saying or writing to what they know you have already studied. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult. And the problem when something is difficult is that you will spend a lot of time on just a few characters. And I'm not talking about unique individual characters here. I'm saying that if you have a text that contains, say, 50 characters in total, a dialogue in your textbook maybe, or a simple story, then it will take you a lot of time to get through this, so the number of characters you see per minute, for example, would be very low. And this doesn't expose you to these words often enough that you will just learn them simply by reading. Because if it takes you this long to read this text where the words you're learning only appear once, then it follows that unless you're rereading the same text over and over, it will take you a very long time to get to a new text, which happens to also contain the words you learned in the first text. And if you're learning like this, you will also have forgotten the words you learned in the first text when you encounter them again. And so this is very frustrating, and it will feel like you're deciphering a secret code or something when you're reading Chinese, and this will persist for quite some time. There are a couple of ways to get around this. One is to try to read more anyway, and that then requires you to have access to lots and lots of material that are written for zero beginners or for your beginner level, and this of course would be true for intermediate learners as well. But you need lots of content, and at a very low level this is difficult. Another way to do it is to rely on flashcards, so this then guarantees that you will see these words over and over, often enough that you actually will remember them. But flashcards also have downsides in that they don't provide enough context, usually, and it's also a very artificial way of studying that many students find boring. Personally, I think the best approach for beginners is to do both. It is rather difficult, as I said, to get enough reading if you don't rely on flashcards as well, because everything will be super hard and you will need to rely on a dictionary all the time. But if you add some flashcards and if you maintain the most important vocabulary this way, you can get the context from the stuff that you do read, but you then also make sure that you remember at least most of the characters by using flashcards. This is true for listening as well, because of course you can have audio flashcards too. I have written about these topics before on Hacking Chinese, and there are also podcast episodes covering some of the things that I just mentioned. For example, you should definitely check out an introduction to extensive reading for Chinese learners, and even if it says reading there, it could also equally well be applied to extensive listening. This was episode 16 of the podcast. I have also written several articles that give you advice for what to listen to and how, and also what to read and how. And these are some of the articles that took the longest time to write on Hacking Chinese because they contain so many hand-picked recommendations for the best listening and reading materials. So check them out, and these are for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners, and I'll put links to all of this in the show notes. The problem here is related to what I talked about in last week's podcast episode, and that was episode 150, about the illusion of advanced learning, where I basically said that if you're sticking with material that is written for you, such as a textbook series where the authors build everything on what you've done in previous chapters, then you will be reading more and more difficult text, which is intensive reading then, not the extensive reading that I'm normally recommending. If you pursue this type of learning in isolation for too long, such as if you're learning Chinese in your home country and you don't have that much contact with real-world Chinese, you will get a shock when you leave the classroom because you will figure out that even though you're an advanced learner or maybe an intermediate learner, actually there are lots of very simple things you can't do because your textbook or course didn't cover them. So the way to avoid this problem is, of course, to diversify your reading and listening practice, and this is, generally speaking, good advice. You shouldn't stick with just a textbook or whatever you're doing in your course. You should be finding your own listening and reading material that covers topics that you are interested in, and this is true regardless of anything else I'm saying in this episode. However, it's important to note that diversity also means that the difficulty level increases. So let's say that you are an intermediate student and you follow the advice in last week's episode where I said that you should leave your textbook. You will then find that some things that you encounter are very difficult. Sure, you can use graded readers, and that's great, but as soon as you use real-world Chinese, you will find it hard to heed both the advice to diversify your listening and reading and to do extensive listening and reading, which requires the content to be fairly easy so you can cover enough and actually enjoy what you're doing. For a more in-depth discussion about the pros and cons of using authentic content, or in other words, content that isn't written for language learners specifically, check out episodes 89 and 90 of the podcast. So the problem here is that we need to reconcile the idea that extensive reading and listening and comprehensible input are good, but at the same time we also need to realize that authentic texts and listening material in Chinese can be very difficult, and so we need a solution. And narrow reading and listening is a good solution to this problem. They offer a way to read and listen extensively without drowning in difficult vocabulary, while also making sure that you encounter words and grammar often enough that you can actually learn them just by reading, i.e. incidentally. So narrow here refers to limiting your input in some way, and I'll bring up a few examples to show you what I mean. The first example is listening to the same person speaking Chinese, because you should have noticed if you've spoken with many people that people you're familiar with can be rather easy to understand, but if you're talking with a stranger, that's much more difficult because you're not used to the way they speak. They use different words, they pronounce them differently, they have different favorite expressions, and so on. If you've had more than one Chinese teacher, you have probably noticed this because when you have one of the teachers, you get to know them, you get to know the way they speak and so on, and you gradually get to understand most of what they are saying. But then when you switch to a new teacher, there's always a drop in comprehension because you're not used to the way they speak. So by sticking to the same person, you limit the difficulty, and even if they are talking about something that might be harder for you, at least you have eliminated the differences in different speakers. The second example is reading about the same topic several times. Most Chinese textbooks are built around a few different topics, such as sports, food, or going to the airport, and things like that, which guarantees that every chapter will be difficult because, of course, you need new vocabulary to talk about food. It's not the same as when you talk about sports. And when you go to the airport, the vocabulary you learn to talk about sports is kind of useless. This means that textbooks, as they are mostly used in classrooms, is a prime example of intensive reading. Now imagine if you focused on the same topic 10 times in a row. Well, the first time you read about going to the airport, it would of course be hard. It would be as hard as in a normal textbook. But then when you read the second text about the same kind of topic, some vocabulary will occur again, and so you will stand a better chance of remembering those words and actually learning them. And of course, knowing these words in advance will also make it easier for you to understand the new text and maybe not need to rely on the dictionary or word list so much. Then when you read the third text, it will be even easier. But of course there will still be new words because every author who writes about going to the airport for Chinese learners don't do it in exactly the same way. And then you keep doing this for as long as you want, and the text will be easier and easier, and you will read more and more Chinese. You will cover more and more text without increasing the difficulty. This can be applied to intermediate and advanced learners as well, of course, and I will return to that a little bit later, but imagine that you read 10 articles about the same news event. Well, the first one would be very hard because there are lots of things in the first article you didn't know relating to that specific event or the way people talk about it in the news. But when you get to your 10th article about the same thing, you already have the basic vocabulary to describe the situation, although of course different people will write about it slightly differently. So there will always be some new things, but the important thing is that the core vocabulary required to talk about this topic will occur over and over. So this means you will see the words often enough to actually learn them, without using flashcards if you don't want to. The third and final example is to focus on long-form content, and this is true even for beginners. So there is a misconception that reading long texts is more difficult than reading short texts, and this is just plain wrong. Most of the time, reading a long text is easier than reading a short text, because when you have a short text, like we have seen, the topic is introduced to you, you have lots of new words about this topic, but if the text is long and you just keep going about the same thing, well, then you will be familiar with the core vocabulary, and the longer the text is, the lower the density of new words, which will make it both more enjoyable and easier. If you listened to last week's episode, you might be a little bit confused here, because superficially I think there is a risk of confusing the call for diversity I had in last week's episode with the call to less diversity I have in this week's episode, but I think that these are distinct and quite different. Narrow reading and listening is about limiting the topic you are talking about, the subject matter. It is not about limiting the language to a specific set of words decided by your textbook authors, and these are two very different things. You can imagine that if you were to read, say, 10 chapters about going to the airport in different textbooks, of course there would be diversity in this, but the topic will remain the same, and it's reading and listening that is narrow in that sense. The same applies to reading about the same news event 10 times as an advanced learner. Well, of course, this contains a lot of diversity, but it contains less diversity than, say, reading 10 newspaper articles about 10 completely different events, because unless your reading ability is already really good, this will not count as extensive reading. Before I summarize the main benefits with narrow reading and listening, I should point out that this concept or the idea of narrow reading and listening is not something I have come up with, but instead something I've learned from Stephen Krashen, and it has been written about and developed and researched by lots of people since then. And if you want to read more about this, check out the references and further reading section at the bottom of the article on Hacking Chinese. So let's go through the main benefits of narrow reading and listening. Why should you do this? Why do I think that this should be a core component in most students' learning routine? Well, the first one we've already mentioned, and that is that it lowers the difficulty of authentic content. As I've already said, when you choose something to focus on, then the first texts will be difficult, but the more you keep going in the same direction and the more you read and listen to something within this scope that you've chosen, the easier it will get. If you want more advice for how to lower the difficulty, you can check out my article called 8 Great Ways to Scaffold Your Chinese Learning, and as usual, I'll put links in the description. Benefit number 2 is that it makes flow possible. Because when you read something or if you're listening to something and you get constantly interrupted by not knowing anything about what's going on and you feel frustrated because you have to look everything up, that's not very pleasurable and you can't really be in a state of flow when this happens. But if you read more and more about the same topic and the difficulty drops, this allows you to get into this state, and that is of course desirable. The more you enjoy reading and listening in Chinese, the more you will do it and the faster you will advance. This goes into the third point, which is that it's motivating. Feeling that you can gradually understand more and more gives you a sense of conquering a new territory or learning something new. But if you constantly skip around between different topics, you never really get this feeling because everything is equally hard the whole way, and that can be very demoralizing. I think this is something worth taking quite seriously, because if you don't enjoy what you're doing, you're going to do it less and less and then maybe end up quitting. Next, narrow reading and listening allow you to focus on interesting topics. Yes, sure, you can find interesting topics in materials written for language learners, but to be honest, most things written in textbooks and even in most graded readers isn't that interesting. And when I say this, I mean, is this something you would like to read or listen to in your native language? I mean, if Chinese weren't part of the picture? Probably not, and the things that really interest you, they are usually too hard to do purely in Chinese, at least if you're not already an advanced student. However, with narrow reading and listening, you can choose a topic you're really interested in, and yes, it will be hard in the beginning, but the longer you stick with it, the easier it gets. And obviously, the broader the area is, the longer it will take to get into it. But if you choose a small enough topic and find enough content covering that specific topic, then you can work your way into something you're truly interested in, not just for the purpose of learning Chinese. The final benefit is something I have also mentioned in passing already, and that is that narrow reading and listening integrates learning and reviewing in a natural way. This, I would say, indeed is the main benefit, because you are able to learn something new by reading and listening, but you also recycle old vocabulary because, of course, it will recur over and over if you're reading about the same topics, so you will be able to acquire the vocabulary and grammar usually used when talking about this topic, because they occur over and over. Now that we have looked at the benefits of narrow reading, are there any downsides? Are there any traps or pitfalls you should be aware of? Well, not really, unless you pursue this approach to extremes. While I think that diversifying your input is a good thing, I've already described that this actually does include some diversity, just in a different, more manageable way than if you're choosing new topics every time you pick something to read or listen to. As a beginner, you have so much diversity you can't handle it, at least not without heavily relying on a dictionary, and as I've described, this is not really ideal. As an intermediate learner, it becomes more important to diversify your reading and listening, but since the best way to do that is to approach authentic reading and listening content, using the approach I've described in this episode still allows you to do that, but without falling into the intensive reading and listening pit. Advanced learners are those that need diversity the most, because if you stay within your comfort zone, you will also stagnate and you will not encounter enough new language to keep developing. Still, as I've already mentioned, just because you narrow your focus here, that doesn't mean you don't get any diversity. For example, if you pick a series of books by an author you like and you read 10 books in a row, well, then this is a form of narrow reading, but it's not easy. It's still authentic Chinese and there will be plenty of variety within the books that you're reading. Same thing if you watch hundreds of episodes of your favorite TV show or if you read every single volume in that manga you like. Naturally, you can also switch focus to another topic, and if you really are worried about diversity, well, then make sure to pick something completely different next time. That will definitely take you out of your comfort zone. To conclude this episode, I'd like to say that narrow reading and listening are great for learning Chinese. If you haven't tried this method, you should, and I think everybody stands to gain from narrowing their focus. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.